Good evening, everyone. My name is Phala O, Phala, and I'm the Animateur at the Center for the Less Good Idea. And next to me is
Jane Taylor, and I'm from the University of the Western Cape, the Mellon Chair in Aesthetic Theory and Material Performance.
So welcome to the Center for the Less Good Idea. And for those who do not know what the Center for the Less Good Idea does is we are an incubator space based here in Maboneng, Johannesburg, and incubator space for the arts. And this evening we are here in the SO Academy in conversation. This is our second in conversation. The SO Academy, why so? So is an exclamation that often begins a sentence when people try to explain or speak about what they do. So this is what I am doing. This is how I achieved what I achieved. So over the past 4 years since the founding of the Center for the Less Good Idea by William Kentridge, joined by the first animator of the center in Bronwyn Lace, we have witnessed a kind of an organic learning and unforced learning in our spaces as we build the seasons and do our For Once program. And because of that unforced and organic learning, we found it quite imperative that we start an academy where people can begin to learn an unforced way, but a hands-on kind of learning. The Center for the Less Good Idea, SO Academy, is therefore based on the principle of finding the less good idea, working through our chaos, our senselessness, our incoherency, and as we work through the material of being on the floor, being on the ground, thrusting through whatever ideas we find as artists. And often, as artists, we often begin with quite a beautiful, sometimes beautiful, good idea that collapses. And in the collapse, we have witnessed that the collapse is where the secondary processing, the kind of going through material, starts to form. And that is what the principle for the less good idea is about. It is based on a Setswana saying that I'll say in Setswana, it says, which means when the good doctor has failed, the less good doctor will attend to the disease. So the title for our in conversation today, as we work through Waiting for Godot, is Searching for Godot, Researching Beckett. And I'd like Jane to introduce us a little bit to that journey that we are going through.
The journey began in a way with trying to imagine what we would be doing to help sustain performance arts in the crisis over this past year. And of course, we all found ourselves in a kind of circumstance of waiting. And the person who this century who has explored waiting in perhaps the most profound and transformative way was Beckett. And so it became a natural place to try and think about how do we come to terms with this being in a perpetual anticipation of a transformation of our circumstance. And you'll discover in the performance this evening whether there is any transformative capacity or not. So what we've really done is worked with a group of actors who we hold in real regard and esteem, who are interested in exploring difficult texts. The Center for the Less Good Idea has a range of different inquiries. A lot of its inquiry is about the body and thinking about improvisation, about musical and oral idioms. But the Beckett text is an opportunity to come to terms with large, massive swathes of difficult language and the memorizing project and staying inside a dialogue through character. And what we're going to be doing this evening is sharing with you a couple of the sequences in which characters have come to terms with Beckett through the performance of the idioms of the different characters. And then Phala and I will get together and have a conversation with one another and with you about what we've discovered about Beckett through having to come to terms with the texts that he's produced.
So the actors that we've been working with is Tony Bonani Miyambo, Billy Langa, Gemma Khan, and Stefania de Toit. And we are going to just shift for them, in a little while when they'll perform, about 5 sequences from the performance. And that is basically a process for us of finding, the embodiment in the commas, in the exclamation marks, in the silences. And please enjoy their embodiment of a Godot and a waiting.
Gogo,
What?
did you ever read the Bible?
The Bible. I must have taken a look at it.
Do you remember the Gospels?
I remember the maps of the Holy Land. Colored they were. Very pretty. The Dead Sea was pale blue. The very look of it made me thirsty. That's where we'll go, I used to say. That's where we'll go for our honeymoon. We'll swim. We'll be happy.
You should have been a poet.
I was. Is that not obvious?
Where was I? Oh, yeah. How's your foot?
Swelling, visibly.
Ah, yes. 2 thieves. Do you remember the story?
No.
Shall I tell it to you?
No.
It'll pass time.
No.
2 thieves crucified at the same time as our Savior.
Oh, what?
Our Savior, 2 thieves. One is supposed to have been saved. And
Saved
the other,
from what?
Hell. And the other damned. I mean, how is it that of the 4
I'm
evangelists,
going.
only one speaks of a thief being saved? I mean, the 4 of them were there or thereabout, and only one speaks of a thief being saved. Come on, Gogo. Return the ball once in a way, can't you?
I find this really most extraordinarily interesting.
1 out of 4.
What was I saying?
Let's go.
Please, take the weight off your foot. I implore you, you'll catch a death.
True. What is your name?
Adam,
Yes, the night.
Adam.
But be a little more attentive. For pity's sake, otherwise we'll never get anywhere.
Adam.
Look. Will you look at the sky, pig? Good, that's enough. What is there so extraordinary about it? Qua sky. It is pale and luminous, like any sky at this hour of the day. In these latitudes, when the weather is fine. An hour ago, roughly, after having poured forth ever since, say, 10 o'clock in the morning. Tirelessly turrets of red and white light begin to lose its effulgence, to grow pale, pale, ever a little paler, paler until finished. It comes to rest, But behind this veil of gentleness and peace, the night is charging and will burst upon us. Pop! Like that. Just when you least expect it. That's how it is on this bitch of an earth.
I resume. Fulham Clapham, in a word. The dead lost per head since the death of Bishop Berkeley, being to the tune of 1 inch 4 ounce per head, approximately, by and large, more or less, to the nearest decimal, good measure, round figures, stark naked, stockinged feet, Connemara, in a word, for reasons unknown. No matter. What matter? The facts are there. And considering what is more, much more grave, that in the light of the labours lost of Steinweg and Peterman, it appears what is more, much more grave, that in the light of the labours lost of Steinweg and Peterman, in the plains, in the mountains, and seas, by the rivers, round fire, air is the same. And then the earth, namely, the air and then the earth, in the great deeps, the great cold, the air and then the earth, abode of stones in the great cold. Alas, alas, in the year of their Lord 600 and something. The air, the earth, the sea, the earth, abode of stones in the great deeps, the great cold, on sea, on land, and in the air. I resume. For reasons unknown, in spite of the tennis, the facts are there, but time will tell. I resume, alas, alas. On! In short, in fine, on! Abode of stones, who can doubt it? I resume, but not so fast. I resume. The skull, fading. And concurrently, simultaneously, what is more, for reasons unknown, in spite of the tennis. On! The beard, the flames, the tears, the stones, so blue, so calm, alas, alas. On! The skull in Connemara, in spite of the labours, abandoned, left unfinished, graver still, abode of stones, in a word, I resume. Alas, alas, abandoned, unfinished, the skull in Connemara, in spite of the tennis, the skull, alas, the stones, Cunard, tennis, the stones, so calm, Cunard, unfinished, the stones, so calm, Cunard, unfinished, the stones, so calm, Cunard, unfinished, the stones, so calm, Cunard.
Why will you never let me sleep?
I felt lonely.
I was dreaming, I was happy.
That passed the time.
I was dreaming, I was...
Don't tell me. I wonder, is he really blind?
Blind? Who?
Potter.
Blind?
Yes. He told us he was blind.
You dreamt it.
It seemed to me he saw us.
Let's go. We can't. Are you sure it wasn't him?
Who?
Godot?
But who?
Pozzo?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all.
We might as well get up. Oh, Didi.
I don't know what to think anymore.
My feet, help me.
Was I sleeping? While the others suffered? Am I sleeping now? And tomorrow when I wake or think I do, what shall I say of today? That with my friend Estragon at this place till the fall of night we waited for Godot, that Porto passed with his carrier and he spoke to us? Probably. But in all that, what truth will there be? He will know nothing. He'll tell me about the blows he received, and I'll give him a carrot. The stride of a grave and a difficult birth. Down in the hole, lingeringly, the grave digger puts on the forceps. We have the time to grow old. The air is full of our cries, but habit is a great deadener. At me too, someone is looking. Of me too, someone is saying, he is sleeping. He knows nothing. Let him sleep on. I can't go on. What have I said? Everything is dead but the tree.
What is it?
It's the tree.
Yes, but what kind?
I don't know, a willow?
Why don't we hang ourselves from it?
With what?
You haven't got a bit of rope?
No.
Then we can't.
Let's go.
Wait. There's my belt.
It's too short.
You could hang off my legs.
And who'd hang onto mine?
True.
Well, sure, all the same. It might do at a pinch. But is it strong enough?
We'll soon see. Here.
It's not worth a curse.
You say we have to come back here tomorrow?
Yes.
Then we'll bring a good bit of rope.
Yes.
Didi,
Yes.
I can't go on like this.
That's what you think.
And if we parted, it might be better for the two of us.
We'll hang ourselves tomorrow. Unless Godot comes.
And if he comes,
We'd be saved.
well, shall we go?
Pull on your trousers.
What?
Pull on your trousers.
Pull off my trousers?
Pull on your trousers.
True.
Well, shall we go?
Let's go.
Thanks. Oh, look at you. You're ministering angel. Thank you. Great. Thanks, Ellie.
No, it's fine. So Jane Taylor here is the dramaturg of this play, and I am supposedly the director. And we had quite a beautiful journey with, the actors. When the journey began, we were far apart, zoomed apart, and we tried to do this play. I think it's almost 4 or 5 months now.
Yeah,
In
about
waiting.
March or April.
So we really experienced, as a beginning, the waiting, because over Zoom, Gemma and Jane were in Cape Town, and we had Billy and Tony here in Johannesburg, and we tried to, do something over that, 1,200 kilometers, and all we could achieve was to really read the play. Oh, is the mic not on? Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so it was to really read the play. And in the reading of the play, we sat in the text for a long time, reading the text. And the question that we had with the text was where to begin with this play. The very first line of this play says, "Nothing to be done." That's the very first line. And we found ourselves in a situation where we had nothing to do, nothing to be done. And the biggest question was, what is to sit with the waiting? What is to, evoke a spirit of Godot? What is to search for Godot? And where do you find Godot? And one of the things was you find, the characters and the world of the play by following the footsteps of the author. And that journey, began quite a lot with our dramaturg. And I like, Jane to basically speak to the baby steps of, researching and embodying, the searching and the researching.
Just before I do that, I want to make sure that everybody understands what the waiting is and give you some sketch. Some of you may know the play and some of you may not. The situation that we see the fragments from here you've got two homeless people, Gogo and Didi, Vladimir and Estragon, and they've had an appointment. They've got a designation. They're supposed to meet someone on a particular day in a particular place. And neither of them is entirely sure who they're meeting and whether they're in the right place at the right time. And while they're there, we watch them in their extraordinarily detailed, crafted relationship between one another. We can tell through their interactions, through the physicality and their intimacy, that they've been in a relationship of mutual caring, mutual bonding, and bondage of a particular kind, that they both love and loathe one another because they're sort of locked together in this perpetual relationship of waiting. And into that scene arrive another pair, and they are Pozzo and Lucky, a master and slave. And Pozzo is bringing Lucky to the fair. He's got a rope around his neck, and he's going to sell him. And so the one couple is kind of drawn in a kind of metaphoric relation to explore the other. And the terms of those two modes of bondage are really the terms upon which Beckett is engaged in the exploration. So we started trying to think about what was in Beckett's mind, what is the texture of this relationship of obligation and wretchedness that Beckett is exploring in the play. The historical representation of the Beckett archive is that Beckett is an existentialist looking at the large questions around the human subject and how we are not in control of our destinies and that circumstances are imposed on us and we are wretchedly clawing our way from the cradle to the grave. But as I began to explore particularly the long speech of Lucky, who is talking about a range of fragments, Connemara, Cunard, Bishop Berkeley, the skull in Connemara, what is it that is the substance of Lucky's speech that gives us some of the texture of the mental universe of Beckett when he's constructing the characters and constructing these relations? And the most striking thing that I came across that is more or less invisible inside the Beckett archive is that Cunard, who is mentioned 6 times in the long speech, is the first person who ever commissioned Beckett, who ever published Beckett. Published a more or less autobiographical poem called Whoreson, which is a meditation on the wretchedness into which we are all born. And she went on from there to be a really powerful advocate of Beckett's across his creative career, and in a tremendously significant way for us in South Africa. Nancy Cunard, who was an heiress to a massive shipping fortune, she more or less walked away from her destiny and walked away from the economy that she was supposed to inherit, because in the 30s, she published an anthology called Negro. And in that anthology, she published writings about the circumstance of blacks in the diaspora in the United States, in Haiti, in a range of different countries around Africa and in the Caribbean, countries that had been subjected to abuse and exploitation. And a number of the writers who wrote for her about the history of destitution and oppression and slavery were French writers. And she commissioned Beckett to translate 17 of those meditations on the circumstances of blacks across the world, and that became part of this kind of groundbreaking anthology of a meditation on the situation of the black subject in the 1930s. And she was kind of reviled by the press. She became kind of ridiculed in the mainstream media. She was the darling of a number of artists. Man Ray photographed her. I don't know how many of you know Man Ray's photographs. There's a very famous photograph of a woman in profile holding an African mask. Brancusi made sculptures of her and so on. So she became associated with outsider culture and an advocate of left-wing human rights. She was also very strongly engaged in the Spanish Civil War. Beckett himself also did a great deal of research into the abuses in the Congo. He studied the writings of a fellow Irishman, Roger Casement, who did the expose around the Leopold and the abuses in the Congo in the rubber plantations. And Beckett was researching Casement's archive of human rights violations under the relationships of labor. And so that's all in the background, and that filters its way into the play in the most oblique ways. So it's really only through sitting with the play for several months that one picks up these fragments and these traces and understands that what Beckett is raging against is the circumstances of imperial oppression. And that metaphor that we see of Lucky and Pozzo, who are dragging one another around with the rope. And the one striking thing that you don't know that I hadn't sketched here, that's alluded to in the fragment that we saw, is in the second half of the play, Pozzo, the overlord, is blinded, and Lucky becomes his kind of caregiver. So it's a very perverse meditation on power and relations. And so that's the kind of core inquiry. And then really the burden inside the making of the play is to examine what is the texture of the intimacy between these different modes of bondage. And one of the questions we were really interested in considering is, what is the circumstance of the homeless person who is in that kind of designated anticipation of life being transformed into something better? What is that in relation to the bondage of the employer and the employee? So in the South African circumstance, that becomes a very vexed and engaging question for us to think with.
You have said quite a lot about sitting in that kind of history. And one of the things that comes to mind is, as you're speaking, and we often have this long discussions as a director and dramaturg of the piece, is the woman influence in the beginnings of thinking about a text like Waiting for Godot, because Nancy Cunard comes 6 times, and you see that the work of Nancy Cunard is actually quite interesting, and that's what somehow led us to the question of what is to have the two characters of Pozzo and Lucky being acted by women, which is something that a lot of times is frowned upon in an experiment with Beckett. But the question is, if Beckett himself has had so much influence from Nancy Cunard, to write and to the extent that the whole speech of Lucky is based on this, what is it to embody and to try and transfer the kind of the feelings that he had from whence they began, which is a kind of a relationship of some sort with Nancy Cunard, and that is why the inquiry on the having women play male characters or traditionally male characters. The other thing that comes to mind is the question about the universality of the oppression, the slavery, the bondage, but also finding the locale in it, because there's quite in Beckett you find a lot of universal themes. But what is to perform? The biggest question that we asked ourselves is that in these times of Corona, when Beckett wrote the play, it was after war, and then in this time of Corona, how do we find the locale in the text? What is it that brings us to this text and resonates in a South African context, in an African context, and that's why the kind of themes about destitution, about homelessness. One of the greatest kind of debacles with lockdown time was, how do we deal with the homeless people? How do you take them, from the street? And most of them ended in concentration camp lookalike. And that question of the freedom, slavery, enslavement, bondage, oppression, and the oppressed is something that we needed to sit with this play and begin to find ways in which it sits in a space like this one. One of the greatest things that I have, as a director, was battling with was the tree. The tree in Waiting for Godot is mentioned, as almost 4 things. It's a tree, and then it's named as perhaps it doesn't say it is a willow. Perhaps it is a willow tree. And then I looked at the willow trees. And then there's an argument between Gogo and Didi where the other one says it's a shrub. The other one says it's a bush. And the question that I had was like, how does this tree, willows are big. How does it then transform into a bush? It transformed into a shrub. And for me, it was one way in which, Beckett deals with perspective. Beckett has written these beautiful characters that you think of Gogo and Didi, Vladimir, Estragon, as people who are quite below. And it gives you even somebody lower in a Lucky. And none of these characters, except for Pozo, is basically, somebody who's, we can say middle class, or even, bourgeoisie, if you could. But that's the kind of world that we're dealing with. And how does one translate that world into a space like this? How does one begin, to find a texture and a kind of a representation that resonates, rather than trying to purely and classically deal with a Beckett? Hence, today's topic, we are searching. We do not think that we have found what we are searching. We continue to search every day. We are searching for Godot, and we are researching, Beckett and finding, ways in which Beckett sits with us. And with that, I'd like you to, speak, about the scarce economy, the kind of, meditation that we are sitting with in a South Africa that is going through, quite, different kind of phases, and how that relates to our treatment of the piece.
I'm very interested in Phala's consideration around the casting of 2 women in the roles of Lucky and Potso, also because one is aware of the ways in which gender does the work of race in this country, that so much of the distribution of hierarchy of powers of persons across class and race is carried through women who themselves are receivers of an oppressive system, and they themselves become oppressors. So it's a very intriguing way of just holding in mind the complexity that Beckett was so strongly conscious of. Just to go back into the archive very briefly, in the 30s, Beckett wrote a collection of short stories called More Pricks Than Kicks, in which he talks about reproduction and rights over bodies and the abortion and so on. A very vexed question in Ireland, as it has been to the middle of the last decade. And the book was actually one of the forbidden books in Ireland. So Beckett himself has a very strong sense of the asymmetries inside the gender distribution of rights and the protection of the human subject and so on. So that's one set of meditations that you help us bring to mind. And I'm also thinking about the singularity of what emerges in the relationship between Didi and Gogo. As even in these small fragments that you've seen, they're not just 2 homeless men. They are such distinctively individual beings. Gogo is incredibly pragmatic. He is concerned about his physical being. He's anxious about his boots. He's always agitated by his physical discomfort. And Didi is a metaphysician. Didi is remembering the stories from the Bible. He's thinking about who is watching him, what are his ethical obligations, and so on. And so inside the crafting of 2 characters who are given the same economic and physical circumstances, Beckett has worked at this distribution of massively distinctive sensibilities, so that part of what's exquisite in the piece is that everything that Didi has as a capacity, Gogo lacks. And what Gogo has as a capacity, Didi lacks. So this kind of supplementary relation between the two of them. And you see a little bit of it crafted in the fragments that you saw here, but really to see it evolve over the arc of the shape of the play, the increasing frustration and the increasing dependence between the two of them is pretty remarkable inside the performances that Billy and Tony give.
I mean, the thing that is quite interesting, you know, that reminds me of, you know, how Beckett has written, you know, the fragmented identities and how those fragmented identities are, you know, connecting to the fragmented, you know, space and places. And one of the things, and you're speaking about the relationship, the symbiosis, you know, between the relationship. And Beckett writes a tree, you know, for me, you know, writes a tree into this piece. And in the first act, the tree has no leaves at all. And when we look at humanities, that the trees give us, you know, oxygen, we give the trees carbon dioxide. And this is you know, somebody who's contemplating about, you know, the kind of the connection in life. And when you look at the beginning of the piece in Act 1, you know, almost for me, the tree, you know, lives in Gogo. The tree is a lucky, you know, in Act 1, and it turns over in Act 2, where the tree now has got leaves. And when the tree has got leaves, miraculously, you know, you start to really feel the hope that somebody like, you know, Didi has. But it's quite interesting that towards the end, even him, you know, almost gets out of, you know, the hope, but also goes back to the hope in that, you know, there still will be tomorrow. But the shop comes in where you see Pozzo is now blind and is being led by Lucky. He's dependent on Lucky for direction. Lucky, who was quite low in status in Act 1, has now been elevated to become the eyes, you know, of a Pozzo. And that kind of symbiosis that happens where Beckett sits and writes, you know, about the tree, and people, you know, are contemplating about the tree. He writes about the earth where they are. He writes about the leaves. He said the leaves murmur, they speak, they rustle. So there's a kind of a thing about where he takes that which happens inside internally in, you know, a human psyche and places in a world. And this world that can happen anywhere, this world that can be in Afghanistan, this world that can be in South Africa, this world that can be inside of a human being, this world that can be inside a shack, this world that can be anywhere else, when people are reflecting on their kind of connection to you know, some kind of a universal way of being. And indeed, in this one, the speech, he says, you know, to me also, someone is looking. And often when we do bad things, we think no one is looking. We think no one is watching us.
There's a marvelous moment that I know that Phala has taken profoundly into himself as he's been thinking about the construction of the performances. And it's a moment in which Pozzo, the overlord, is asked by Gogo and Didi whether Lucky can perform for them in some way. And Lucky gives the most grotesque dance, which he is referred to as the net. He thinks he's entangled in a net. And it's hilariously catastrophic to watch, this being trying to claw their way out of a circumstance. But after that fragment of a dance, he embarks in this very lengthy meditation in which the nature of the disciplining of the body, it talks about the tennis, and it talks about different kinds of rowing, and talks about the ways in which the body conquers its own kind of animalistic nature. And it also talks about metaphysics, and it talks about the histories of the skull and the human subject. At the end of the speech, Pozzo, the master, acknowledges that Lucky is the one who has taught him the finer things in life. That without Lucky, he had no idea about ethics, about morals, about aesthetics, that it took the relationship with Lucky for him to see the complexity of the world that was charged around him. And that's a really powerful and extraordinary meditation for this. He acknowledges that without Lucky, all he would think about was business arrangements and the boardroom. And there's this whole universe that Lucky can make available to Pozzo. And so part of that dependency is that Pozzo, for all of his grotesque character, has the capacity to see these realms of insight inside Lucky.
I mean, the thing that is also interesting for me about the dance is when Pozzo is asked, what is it? When he calls it, that Lucky thinks he's entangled in a net. And one of the things that came through this year was an entanglement. There was about Will Smith and the wife, and one of the things that we find ourselves in South Africa entangled in, with the lockdown, we have been entangled in a network of corruption. There's been entanglement, caught in the net. Many people caught in the net of the Zondo Commission, caught in the net of the PPEs, where people are profiteering from, a chaos. Because all the time, one of the things that exacerbates chaos in a life is when you think that others are seeing chaos, others are seeing opportunity. And that kind of an opportunity plays out in a situation where Pozzo is trying to prove to this gentleman who have never asked for any proof that this is a person who can think, this is a person who can dance. He's displaying power by things that do not really are up to proving any power, and to people who do not want power proven to. And it's a kind of a thing that sat with me, that a lot of times we find ourselves entangled in imaginary nets because we have found a way in which we put ourselves in situations of undesirability and all this kind of things. And politically in South Africa, that resonated. The entanglement with the net resonated, especially when the president put us into level 1 or 2, I do no longer know where the levels are now, and said, we must go and dance Jerusalem, as if Jerusalem will give us something. And then out of that entanglement was, for me, the kind of a president that asks us to dance. And I compared that to what, Trump had said to the Americans. And I said, how, fooled we thought, that, things would be better after, one other president who we thought, was worse. And I think that is one of the things that for me, the dancing, the simple things of dancing, the simple things of entanglement that we find ourselves in, that is quite interesting and profound about the way in which the master Beckett writes. The truth, is sitting in this text. In every day, I find new things that are quite relevant to the situation in South Africa, to our journeys. I mean, Jane and I are also, in our searching and researching, we have been, meditating together over a number of, things. One of the people that we have been meditating over and drawing parallels as we are getting into Beckett has been Saul Plaatje. And it's quite interesting that, one of the things that Saul Plaatje was interested in was interpreting and translating, Shakespeare. He was also interested in the double, and we find the doubles in the couples in a Beckett. And we're sitting in this inquiry not to find answers per se, but to kind of immerse ourselves and embody the research that we are going through, and to sit in this thought and hoping that others who are also meditating over text will find an interest in what we have done. And one of the things that I have been grappling with since university was, the kind of steps of dealing with text, intertextuality, texture, and all these things that have got the word text in it. And one of the discoveries here for me was what the body of work that a Dramaturg brings in mining the urtext, of the whole world that becomes a master text for where people drew, lines from. And the urtext that were found in Waiting for Godot for Beckett has been, the Nancy Cunard. And that urtext is written and planted, right in the speech of Lucky. And it has been an interesting discovery to sit with, Jane Taylor and think almost every bit. We were stuck for a long time in what it means, for a play to begin with, nothing to be done.
One other small fragment just for us to be emboldened by, because very often one thinks that these are texts that belong to the world but don't really in some way belong to us. And what does one do to understand and apprehend Beckett as one of our playwrights? It's intriguing to know that Beckett in 1937, when he had a very acrimonious dispute in Ireland around a case of anti-Semitism, that he was defending someone against a piece of anti-Semitic writing, and he was sort of enraged and furious with his Irish background, he applied for a job at the University of Cape Town. Ironically, in the Italian department, and he was turned down because he wasn't a first language Italian speaker. So Beckett has been thinking in a relationship to Africa, in a relationship to servitude, to homelessness, and he is, by rights, part of our kind of lineage. I know that also Dennis Brutus wrote to him, and various others engaged with him about the cultural boycott, and Beckett did explicitly say that Waiting for Godot could never be performed in front of a white audience in South Africa. So he's had us in the corner of his eye. So at some level, we decide it's time to repay the compliment and to put Beckett in the center of our vision.
I mean, and it's also interesting how a lot of restrictions are thought about somebody who was such a border crosser. And it's also interesting, something that Jane and I were talking about as we were looking at some of the most famous, authors and playwrights and short story, writers that we have come across. It was not until Beckett wrote in French, that he became a renowned writer that he was. It was not until Franz Kafka was writing in German as well, and a number of several, great writers had to cross, a border of some sort in order for them to gain a freedom. And one of the things that is interesting is that how then we dare restrict, such kind of free minds that are about inquiry and border crossing. And for me, it's a simple thing and a notion of acknowledging that there's no one way of seeing, the same thing. And there are multiple ways and multiple views of seeing and sitting, in a thought, in a comma, in an exclamation mark, in a sentence, in a phrase, in a word, in a grain of dust that somebody might see as a mountain. And we sit here on the earth and trying to evoke and trying to, a world of somebody who wrote somewhere many years ago, just after war. And it's quite interesting for me what text does and how it grows, in terms of meaning by those who apply the meaning to it. There are so many words that shows you that don't make grammatic sense in this play. If you're looking for grammar in this play, you will be in problems, because sometimes you find the meaning after you've said the sentence. Sometimes you don't know the meaning at all, and you're going around the meaning. One of the frustrations with the actors that I had, was that they wanted me to block the play, go there, do that, and I never do that to plays. as a director. I never block plays. I just don't like the word blocking. I feel like it's a way of blocking the mind of somebody else. So my way of working with plays has always been map the play, map the understanding, set in the text, understand, give multiple meanings. Let somebody also have their own interpretation. And as a director is to open up that canvas and let the people paint. And sometimes they will paint outside the frame. And when they paint outside the frame and say, no, that's outside the frame, put it in the frame. Because the text for me becomes that kind of a frame. And I can never also, I think somebody who blocks plays is somebody who has elevated themselves to a better understanding of the text. And I never think that I have understood the text better than anyone else. As we sit in the room, my job is a simple one of sitting and say, that's nice. No, that's not nice. Oh, that's good. Oh, beautiful. Oh, or sometimes to just sit and see people struggle. And I enjoy the struggles because in the struggles, we find. In the struggles, sometimes, there's a mishap. And in this mishap, you find something else. And, in mishaps, sometimes you find the happiness. And that has been, a kind of a journey that, we've been involved in. And at the center, a lot of times, we do work with improvised work, because we really we're sitting with the body as an inquiry, the mind, the interdisciplinarity. And whenever we get a chance to do text, we try by all means to find what it says and elsewhere of a text, and now here of a text, as opposed to a kind of an overall classical interpretation or academic interpretation of sorts. I have never, as a person, been a great, fan of staying in the rows. I'm a border crosser. I am born to parents of border crossers. So I've always, been untamed in my way of doing stuff. And working with Jane has been such a beautiful thing because she's also untamed. And in that way, we found the untamedness of a Beckett. And on that note, I'd like you to give your kind of a summary of what your search and research has been and the meanings that it has, now, given you, Jane. And I don't know where this, journey takes us now.
Before we actually embarked on the Godot project, I had a small inquiry which was around a 30-second Beckett play. He is one of the wild ones, called Breathe, which is it's really a site-specific work which is about garbage. It's set in somebody's home, and all you can see is the accumulation of the detritus in their world, and the play, it looks at that scene, and then you just have an intake of breath. And it does feel to me as if Beckett has, in a very profound way, helped us to think about what we take in and what we put out into the world. I don't know how many of you came to the first season and saw the performance of Not I, which is almost a piece of theatrical abuse in which a performer is strapped into position, and all that you see on stage is the mouth of the character, and you see and hear words being emitted from a mouth which is life-size inside a kind of a blackened canvas, speaking as if it is the voice occupying, as an alien being, the presence of the physical performer. And so Beckett helps us to think through our displacement always, that we are ill at ease inside ourselves. And part of our obligation is to come to terms with the fact that we are meant, our combat, our endeavor throughout our creative inquiry is to stay inside that situation of discomfort and to understand the implication of the way that we have lived. I think our generation has come to terms with something of the catastrophe that we have precipitated around us. And of course, another of Beckett's plays is Catastrophe. And to think going forward how we can think about the possibility of the mutuality of someone like a Gogo and a Didi the collaborative endeavor, the redistribution of resources and capacities between beings in order to make something that's more sustainable.
Yes, I have a last question that I'll ask you, but I just want to open up to some questions if there are some questions in the audience. And that question is, sit with the question that I have for you, which is, what is to Dramaturg a waiting for Godot? So sit with that question. And, before I open to the audience, just a thought that, George Borge says, for every rational line or forthright statement, there are leagues of senseless cacophony, verbal nonsense, and incoherency. And I'm saying this because we might have had a lot of verbal nonsense as we're speaking and some incoherency. So bear with us in our senseless cacophony, because sometimes thinking aloud is not one of the most prettiest things. So questions, of our senseless cacophony. Yes, ma'am? We don't have the mic. I'll hear you from here and I'll repeat your question.
Congratulations to both of you. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation of Beckett, and to your actors, congratulations to them. Just to ask about absurdism.
Yeah.
About Beckett being one of the godfathers of the idea of absurdism, and as you both speak so well and in conversation with each other about his work and the sort of absurdity that the ways in which Lewis and Corsi, for example, speaks about apartheid, and we can even think about the times that we're living in now being this normalization of absurdity, right? And it's always been the absurd. What do you think about absurdism? What absurdism means for you to be putting it on display right now in the Center for the Less Good Idea, and what Beckett and what he is doing with absurdism might say to the sort of absurdities that most South Africans, most of us locally, are facing as part of a normal life, that the current state of the nation and everything that's going on locally and global, there's an absurdity going on that none of us can ignore, but that all of us have to accept. And here you are doing this wonderful production, but you are dealing with one of the grand masters of absurdism. And what did that do to inform your process?
One of the things that sits with me was that, and with Jane, was often his speech is often referred to as verbal diarrhea, verbal nonsense. And that became the beginning of our inquiry, because a lot of times this kind of, the absurd is often defined as widely unreasonable, illogical, and inappropriate. And we were like, would somebody write, about 3, pages of a speech that is, just illogical and does not make sense? And the reason why I'm going there in the long-winded way of asking your question is because sometimes what we think is absurd is actually because, it reveals. The absurd often becomes a reveal of our inner truths, of our fallibility, of our flirtation with danger and violence and other things that we do not want to acknowledge we are. And that's why, for me, absurdity finds resonance. One of the things that has happened in South Africa, which I find it quite, depressing, and was, I remember it was in 2011, I went away for some time, and when I came back to South Africa in 2012, I saw a very weird thing of every kind of newspaper that I was reading was rape, 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 rape. I was like, have I been so far away, from South Africa and that, I come back and, all of a sudden there's a lot of cases of rape. And then that forced me to go into an inquiry about, what that would mean and created a play called Cantus Reborn about a child who refuses to be born into South Africa today because, the moment, they're about to be born, they are thinking about, do I want to be born into this world where the girl child is getting raped? And this child decides, no, I'm going back to be a wanton spirit because I cannot live in a world that has got so much kind of sadness, violence, and all that. And it was and then the ending for me was a bit difficult because here I am saying this about that, and then this woman is going to have miscarriage, which, almost, speaks about, unhappiness in a way. And it's those kind of things that I was battling with. And because of that, absurdity, and I found that absurdity becomes a kind of a point where one meditates on their fallibility and sometimes falsehood and sometimes dishonesty. And I think Beckett does that so well because I remember reading a passage as I was researching where, somebody was commenting that Beckett writes characters from his head. He's having a conversation with himself and about the outside world and what he has internalized of it. And it is relevant to South Africa today for me because we are now sitting with a lot of problems that also show our inappropriateness, our illogical sense. And that's why, for me, this resonates. We have been through apartheid. It feels like it didn't do much to us because now we have turned against each other. There's a lot of, crime. And you can see the absurdity of South Africans because what we do, we often turn our pain into something that, becomes a thing to laugh about. You look at, the song now, John Vuligate, Nasi Stoko. When you get into the nitty-gritties of what that is and what it really means and where the Stoko aspect comes from, the belittling of women, that they are only, enough to be called a prized commodity. And we are also commenting on John, who might be, a gatekeeper, a John who might be, John male, who must open gates. Who is this John who must open gates for people? Is he the God or is he the president? So those are some of the things that South Africans often do. That's why the most famous songs in South Africa are songs that are quite illogical in their sense. There's quite absurdity about the way in which we interpret the world. And for me, that's what sits with me in a Beckett, is that kind of an investigation and an inquiry into our absurdity, into our fallibility. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a meditation that I'm sitting with. And there's another question there.
I would like to add to the conversation of absurdity and why play about waiting for Godot I think is quite relevant. Is the search for a godlike figure which requires a degree of quietness. And isn't it absurd to think within South Africa that the moment when we can find a togetherness, we're quiet, and it doesn't matter. But when we watch sport, and we yell, and we see that, that try that wins the game, then suddenly we're all South Africans. We're all together.
Yeah, that kind of, the unity in temporality is what we are best at. We want those kind of, the euphoria of temporality is what, we don't like facing the hard facts. We don't want to deal with that. Most of the time, when we are faced with the actual, meaty stuff to deal with, when we are faced in moments of reflection, we don't want to do that. We feel like, you see that in debates. One of the most missed opportunities for me, I remember when I was at school, and I was very sad. I don't know if you remember the "Don't touch me on my studio" moment, where there was a guy who said he is a racist. And then as he was about to speak, there was, quite a rage about, him, and he never got to speak. It's like, how do you miss in South Africa? You let somebody go. Listen to this person. He's the first one to admit, I am a racist. So let's hear him out. If you silence him, then you've actually taken away the biggest opportunity we had to understand racism by a self-confessed racist. Others have said, no, I'm not racist. I've got 3 white, black, and colored people. You understand? So this is a man who comes. And then all of a sudden, this person is admitted. Give him a platform to speak so that we know and understand what makes him that. Not to say we accept it, but the fact that there's somebody who's willing to speak and that person is silenced, are we not being racist ourselves in silencing that voice? It's those kind of things that, sometimes when I'm like, oh my God, I wish I was there. I was going to say, Mr. Racist, I'm listening. Just go on. And I was going to give him the platform to say it all without, even trying to interrupt and ask him questions, because for me, it was an important thing that perhaps could have moved South Africa into understanding how people become racist, in understanding otherness. Because for me, that's what racism comes from. It comes from, understanding otherness, or not understanding otherness, or accepting it. Comments, Jane? And then you answer me on your dramaturgy.
Just a little bit about the thinking about the absurd and the power of the inquiry that Beckett engages in here. And that's, he insists in pretty unambiguous ways on our species' capacity to deflect our obligation onto an external agency. I will be able to get through this if something acts upon my life. I am waiting for an external circumstance. I will be a better person if these factors are transformed. And the lessons that Didi gives us throughout the play of having to be attentive to oneself and taking responsibility for one's own being and one's own relations in every moment that one is observing. I think, in some ways, the absurd is because we're engaged in this perpetual deflection that something outside of the logic of the reality of your circumstance is going to solve your circumstance. The only thing that solves your circumstance is being attentive to that event and that moment in its immediate demands and obligations. And so to think about the dramaturgical question, it has been a salutary reckoning in some ways, because in South Africa, because of the scarcity of the performance economy, one rushes into performance. And you think that I have to get the thing on the boards in 3 weeks and we have to have the show up and running and the doors open. There was something in the perverse and brutalizing circumstances of the lockdown that gave us the time to reflect on what the play was saying, gave us the opportunity to do the research.
Yeah.
So part of the privilege of just being able to stay there and find out what it was that Beckett was saying in all of those curious, enigmatic codes that he had filtered into the text. He was communicating with us in an incredibly rich and oblique way. It's almost as if Lucky's speech is the political unconscious of the play. It's showing us all of the archive of what made Beckett who he was. And so really the thing that I would encourage us to do as we, the economies are not going to be normal again. The arts are in real peril and real crisis. I think our obligation is to take every opportunity that we can to constitute a space in which thinking about performance, thinking about texts happens in a community of people who are engaged in the same set of questions, and to take the time and find companions who will engage in the conversation with you.
I think, I mean, on that note, it's quite a profound way in which, to reflect on what the journey has been. First, acknowledging this is the first time that, ever since, the March lockdown, that we have opened, in this time, opened our doors to an audience, and we appreciate that you are here. And in a social, distancing, we moved from online to now we are in social distancing theater, and we never know whether things will ever really get back to a normal again. But I am hopeful, having, gone through some Spanish flu at some time when people were putting on masks, and then at some point, things were found. I'm hopeful in that. And in the play, we also use, masks. Because, and it's one such mask, sits with me here, made out of, a bottle, homeless people could do. We saw a number of this kind of masks when the lockdown started to happen. And for me, I would say it is a time, of course, to think about theater, to think about writing, to think about the arts in a kind of a way. And I'll make an invitation to people that, the center is open for ideas, for a meditation, for collaboration. We are a space that encourages and incubates, new work. We often say that if it can't happen elsewhere, it needs to happen at the center. Whether it be, a 5-minute idea, a 7-hour idea, whatever it is, because here at the center, we're not confined to time, confined to other kind of, conventional ways. For us is what sits with, a working through stuff, and it's an invitation to the world out there, those who will be watching us on YouTube, that that's what the center exists for. Founded by somebody who is an artist himself, was about how does one not worry about proposals and other things, but worry about the work, that your work is evidence enough of your thinking and your intellectual capacity, your emotional capacity, your spiritual capacity. And on that note, I say thank you for coming and joining us in an attempt to search and research. And we have the performances tomorrow and Saturday. And unfortunately, they are fully booked in this kind of setting. So if you've not booked your ticket, sorry. Okay. Tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and for coming.